So now I want to turn to chapter 5, ethical considerations. So I'm still working out of the Krishnan book, Killer Robots, the Legality and Ethicality of Autonomous Weapons. Ethical considerations. Okay, the legal moral distinction. I'm just going to say a few words about that. He starts the chapter off. That's an interesting historical, philosophical, theological question. Namely, what does this really mean? Where, in the sense of where does law and morality, where do they separate exactly? How do they relate to each other? How do they separate? There's lots and lots of discussion. Historically, the law and morality was closely linked. It was also bound up with theology. So, for instance, in the Middle Ages, if you look at the thought of Aquinas, and he talks about natural law and human law, divine law, all these things, they were all intimately connected. And the notion of separating out law, that, where it's just this sort of abstract set of principles that, what we normally think of, like, for instance, here in Canada, we talk about, lawmakers, we elect politicians, and then they go off to the parliament buildings and the legislatures around the country, and they draft up things, and then they pass them, and we get laws out of the deal. That is a very secular notion of law, that it's a human creation, independent of things such as religious ideas or whatever, even sometimes independent of morality, that nobody's really talking about that. We're just talking about law, and sometimes people refer to that as positive law. There's a number of discussions. So, but that has not always been the case, where we're often societies regarded their laws as reflection of divine principles. Like the Romans held that the Roman state and its laws were kind of like an instantiation of Jupiter, right? And laws in ancient Greece were regarded as being deeply connected with deity. So violating the laws of the city was offending a god, right? And Socrates got into real trouble over that one. And, he had to drink some hemlock, so they got rid of him. So this idea of the separation of law, morality, theology, religion, all that stuff, it occurred in different places, in different ways, at different times, and it didn't always occur. So there are some societies that don't make all these distinctions, and we should be aware of that. So not to say that just anything goes and be a complete relativist about these distinctions, but at least to be historically sensitive to in the sense that it didn't occur in the same way in all times. And if you want to say, for it's a kind of a loose term in Western thought, that separation of legality and morality, legal and the moral, it didn't occur till around roughly the time of Hugo Grotius. And so this notion of really uncoupling the notion of law from theology. All right, so let's just, if you want to investigate that, that's a case-by-case thing. But my concern is not this historical one, although as interesting as it is. I just want to look at some more moral issues involving these autonomous weapons in war, without really going too much into the legal stuff and the religious stuff, as interesting as that is. Now, it's contestable as how should we regard autonomous weapons as just extensions of ourselves, and then take our ethics and just apply it to autonomous weapons. People often talk about, oh well, if you got autonomous weapons are something new, so you need a new form of ethics. I'm kind of leery of that kind of sort of discontinuity type thinking, where it's like, oh, we just need a new kind of ethics. You'll hear that. That's a possibility, but it's not. That would be the conclusion of an argument for me. That is, you'd have to give me an argument that leads to we need a new kind of ethics, rather than just starting to claim we need a new kind of ethics simply because we have new technologies. Nonetheless, let's carry on. So the laws of armed conflict put some general parameters on the discussion, but not as many as we might think. So again, we are kind of stuck in the position of doing real philosophy, and real philosophy means that you don't have some kind of text that you can just say, oh, well, here are the rules and this is how it works, and we judge cases based on the text. That's again more of like having sacred scripture or having a set of law books that you just pull off the shelf, and you either look at the rules or you look at previous cases and you judge on that. Philosophers, we don't tend to have that luxury, and so we're forced to think outside of texts and outside of systems, and that you either like that or that can drive you crazy. I like it. So now there are some philosophers that like Foucault, who was a specialist in ethics and war, and he says, well, look, there's some circumstances where it's perfectly moral to use fairly horrific weapons like poison gas. If you have it and you've been unjustly attacked with it, then responding in kind might be a responsible measure, a measured response. That is, responding in kind. You're attacked with it, you use it back. And the old cliche, asks us to reconsider it in the sense of it's not if you have it, you will use it. So, we shouldn't bring out these kinds of weapons because if you have them, you'll use them. No, you should be thinking of it from this line. If you're wondering about what's going on in the autonomous weapons development, think about it this way: if your enemy has the autonomous weapon, some kind of thing, and you don't, right? Then you're in serious danger. Look out, because chances are you're going to have it used against you. So this is a kind of deterrent argument, right? Is autonomous weaponry, or are autonomous weapons a deterrent? It's pretty early to say, and most, this is again an old argument of when your enemy develops a pretty powerful weapon, you better develop the same thing to keep them at bay. Now, the author wants to look at the autonomous weapons in connection to the just war tradition and beyond. And yes, maybe new ethical challenges are posed, but new opportunities. So let's look a little bit at some of the arguments in favor and some of the arguments against autonomous weapons. So, okay, so arguments in favor. Well, what's in favor here? Well, militaries, you might be able to say that militaries using autonomous weapons could be more effective, more efficient, even more environmentally friendly than using humans, right? After all, it doesn't take as much energy to get a payload from here to there if it's just using, if it's not, there's no personnel on it, right? Because we humans are fairly large objects, we need a fair amount of fuel to keep the machine going if we're sitting in it. You need life support systems, etc., etc. Drone doesn't need any of that. It needs very little to get off the ground. It's basically just a small engine to get the payload off the ground, whereas you need a much larger one to get human beings somewhere, and then the safety considerations as well. So it shifts, this balance and talk away from quantities to just quality, that we focus on that. So we could say that smaller nations then with autonomous weapons could defend themselves more easily against larger ones. So if your enemy, that used to be the old model regarding nuclear weapons. The Americans tended to pride themselves on fewer but better, more accurate weaponry as when they were facing the old Warsaw Pact. So in that sense, autonomous weapons could be, a reduction in costs in a variety of senses. And it could be arguably that militaries not only have an obligation for defense, but to maximize it, to reduce their costs of, money, right? As I said, it takes less fuel to operate a drone than it does to operate real, manned aircraft. And of course, if a drone crashes, well, at least, from the perspective of if it's your drone and it crashes, well, you might have lost some money, but none of your soldier's life. And that's going to raise other questions about, the value of lives versus your side versus the other. But you can see that people would make this argument that it would be cheaper and more efficient to develop these things rather than always relying on humans being involved. And if you take humans out, then the ethical situation changes. It's arguably more moral. All right. And again, storing high-tech equipment, moving it around, that's easier than working with live human soldiers. So, you don't have to train. Training is easier. All kinds of things are easier and more efficient with artificial technologies than they are with using humans. And of course, that in addition, as I said, if why should we be risking humans? If you can build a machine to do something, right? Why not? Like, look at the space programs. So we probably could be putting a person on Mars right now, but it would be a lot more expensive, a lot more dangerous. And so, we can land these autonomous space vehicles on Mars. So it's that kind of thinking. So why not develop this for warfare? Why would you risk all your citizens like that? We don't have to do that anymore. So it would be, and also a lot of think about the other underlying thing. In the just war theory, it's largely been the tradition that the really key reason for going to war ultimately is one of defense, right? Now think about the number of wars in history that were really wars of defense, and the way that warfare is moving. Nations like, Canada, the US, we're not being attacked, not in that straightforward sense of, that our cities are being attacked by another army trying to, basically violate our territorial sovereignty. It's not like that. So what are the militaries doing now? Well, a lot of them are involved in humanitarian operations, preventing, atrocities and all these kinds of things. The point being is that if warfare is moving away from that older just war notion of, oh yes, you go to war because it's a war of defense, that's the true just war. If we say, no, just wars now really aren't wars of defense, those are wars of humanitarian intervention. Well, those are extremely dangerous wars, taking place overseas. And so if we could build, autonomous weapons to do that, why wouldn't we do that? So it seems, from that old just war model that it's even less of an impetus to go and the risks are greater. Why wouldn't you then put in your autonomous weapons rather than sending your soldiers? So there's less justification for the risk of putting soldiers in harm's way in a humanitarian intervention versus a defensive operation. Your answer is autonomous weapons. Go with that. So the change to interventions could, be another argument in favor of autonomous weapons developed. Better peace or safer peacekeeping, because peacekeeping is often quite dangerous. Well, why wouldn't we develop automated systems for peacekeeping rather than, again, risking more lives? So even from a general kind of utilitarian approach, fewer lives are being risked. Why wouldn't we do that? All right. The lethality of the battle space is going up. So as that gets increasingly more dangerous, more likelihood of being in harm's way if you're anywhere near the battle space. Once again, why wouldn't you opt for autonomous weaponry? The chances of soldiers being kidnapped. We're fighting, as some people say that war is now being increasingly fought outside the standards of the just war tradition, because the just war tradition, remember, breaks into two parts. And in the sense of the justice in war, right? Jus in bello. That is something that, governed what people did during war. Well, if that's breaking down and your soldiers if they're caught, are at greater risk of being, incarcerated in Geneva, breaking of Geneva Conventions and things like that, torture and all these kinds of things. Why would you risk putting soldiers on the battlefield? Again, you don't have to worry about a machine being tortured. It's not the same thing. So again, this would be another favor as the enemy supposedly changes and doesn't function or to follow the traditional rules of jus in bello. Why not go with machines and avoid risking atrocities committed on your soldiers if they happen to be captured? And again, no psychological effects on autonomous weaponry like there is on humans. They don't come home with with PTSD and all these kinds of things. So why would you do that to people? You know, you can avoid that. So overall, you get a more humane. You know, nations are going to use it, so don't keep humans in the game. The best way to defeat an automatic weaponry system of your enemy is with yours, which is better, right? You bring the same kind of weaponry to the fight. You know, as the old expression goes, you don't bring a knife to a gunfight. If the enemy is using autonomous weaponry, well, then you better as well. And robots fighting and killing well, that killing is probably a debatable word, but robots fighting and destroying each other, that doesn't seem to be the ethical equivalent of humans doing it. And so in that sense, you know, it's just robots destroying each other, fewer opportunities for the commission of war crimes as well. You really wouldn't have war crimes in the battle space if it was just populated by robots. That might disappear as a category. You're not even worried about it. It's all property damage now. So, I mean, it still could be illegal and all kinds of things, but it wouldn't be like a crime against humanity. That might largely fade. And so war becomes, again, according to this way of thinking, war could become more ethical, and it's just destruction of property. And so this could have ramifications also for peacekeeping as well, because people aren't being killed in the battle space. It's just property destroyed. That's easier for nations to reconcile over property destruction than over instances of atrocities committed in prisoner of war camps. So there's some, you know, kind of a consequentialist line in general favoring the morality, favoring the development and implementation of autonomous weaponry or artificial intelligence in war. So in the next video, I'll turn to some arguments against